The pristine studio of Global News Network buzzed with pre-show energy as cameras adjusted their focus on Sarah. Mitchell, the network's most prominent international correspondent, her perfectly styled blonde hair caught, the studio lights as she shuffled through her notes, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. The teleprompter displayed the evening's headlines, and one name in particular seemed to amuse her greatly. Ibrahim Traoré, she whispered to her producer, shaking her head with barely contained laughter. The air conditioning hummed softly, creating an artificial coolness that contrasted sharply with the heated discussions happening across the continent she was about to mock. Her makeup artist applied final touches while she rehearsed her dismissive tone. The red light flickered on, signaling they were live to millions of viewers across North America and Europe. Sarah's professional smile masked her personal amusement as she began the segment on African politics. And now we turn to Burkina Faso, where a young captain, barely 30, claims he can transform one of the world's poorest nations. Her voice carried the subtle condescension that had become her trademark when covering African affairs. The producer nodded approvingly from behind the cameras, knowing this tone resonated with their predominantly Western audience. Charts and statistics flashed on the screen, each one seemingly designed to reinforce narratives of African incompetence. Her perfectly manicured fingers gestured dismissively at the images of dusty streets and simple buildings. Ibrahim Traoré, she continued, her pronunciation deliberately careless, wants us to believe that this is former geography. Teacher can challenge centuries of established economic systems. A soft chuckle escaped her lips as she glanced at the photo of the young Burkinabè leader on the monitor. His serious expression in military uniform seemed to amuse rather than inspire respect. From the veteran journalist, the studio crew exchanged knowing glances. This was Sarah at her most cutting, most entertaining for their viewership. Behind her, the network's logo gleamed against a backdrop of world maps that somehow made Africa appear smaller, less significant. Her confidence radiated through the screen as she prepared to deliver what she believed would be her most memorable commentary of the evening. As the segment concluded, Sarah leaned back in her chair with satisfaction, completely unaware that, thousands of miles away in a modest office in Ouagadougou, someone was watching her broadcast with keen interest. The same gentle breeze that cooled the evening air in Burkina Faso seemed to carry with it the weight of unspoken truths and hidden connections. Young activists in university dorms across Africa had recorded her words, their phones buzzing with indignation and determination. The laughter that echoed through the sterile studio walls would soon be replaced by a silence that spoke volumes. Ibrahim Traoré turned off the small television in his office, his expression thoughtful rather than angry, as if he had expected exactly this kind of reception. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he simply made a mental note of a name he would remember. The marble floors of the United Nations building in Geneva echoed with the footsteps of delegates from around the world. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her press badge as she navigated through the crowd, her heels clicking confidently against the Polish stone. She had arrived early for the African Development Summit, expecting the usual parade of politicians making empty promises. The autumn light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the hallway, where diplomats whispered in clusters. Her cameraman trailed behind, equipment ready to capture what she anticipated would be another predictable news cycle. The scent of expensive cologne and political ambition hung thick in the air. A commotion near the main conference hall caught her attention as security personnel moved swiftly to clear a path. Sarah pushed forward, her journalist instincts kicking in as she spotted an opportunity for an impromptu interview. Through the crowd, she glimpsed a young man in a simple dark suit, moving with quiet dignity despite the chaos around him. His presence seemed to calm rather than excite those near him, a stark contrast to the usual fanfare surrounding African leaders. The security detail was minimal, almost humble compared to the extensive entourages she was accustomed to. Covering, her producer whispered urgently in her earpiece, confirming what she had already suspected. Captain Traore, she called out, her voice cutting through the diplomatic chatter with practiced authority. The young leader turned, his dark eyes meeting, hers a mixture of recognition and curiosity. For a moment, the bustling hallway seemed to pause as other journalists and delegates noticed the brewing confrontation. Sarah felt the family thrill of being at the center of a potentially explosive moment. Her cameraman positioned himself strategically, knowing that whatever happened next would make headlines. The captain's slight smile suggested he remembered her recent broadcast, though his expression revealed nothing of anger or defensiveness. "Miss Mitchell," Ibrahim replied softly, his English carrying the gentle accent of someone who spoke multiple languages with equal fluency. The crowd around them had grown, drawn by the unmistakable tension of a journalist confronting her subject. Phones appeared, in hands, ready to capture what promised to be either a spectacular clash or an unexpected revelation. Sarah felt her confidence waver slightly under his steady gaze, though she maintained her professional composure. The autumn air seemed to hold its breath as delegates from across the continent watched one of their youngest leaders face the woman who had publicly mocked his vision. Something in his calm demeanor suggested this encounter would unfold differently than she had planned. Ibrahim's voice remained calm as delegates gathered closer, their conversations fading to whispers in the marble corridor. "You mentioned in your broadcast that I was just a geography teacher," he said, his tone carrying no trace of bitterness. Sarah nodded, her camera crew adjusting their angles to capture what she expected would be defensive justifications. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows seemed to soften his features as he continued speaking. "My mother sold vegetables in the market of Bondaki to pay for my education," he said simply. The raw honesty of his words cut through the political atmosphere like a blade through silk. Every morning before dawn, she would walk 3 kilometers to reach the market stalls, carrying produce on her head. His eyes seemed to look beyond the opulent UN building, back to dusty roads and simple homes. Sarah felt her prepared questions dissolving as she found herself genuinely listening rather than waiting for her turn to speak. The other journalists lowered their aggressive postures, drawn into the quiet power of his storytelling. "She taught me that knowledge without service to your people is just empty pride," Ibrahim continued. The security personnel stepped back slightly, recognizing that this moment required no protection, only witness. "When I studied geography, I learned about the resources beneath our soil. Gold, manganese, uranium, riches that should feed our children." His voice carried the weight of a teacher explaining fundamental truths to students who had never learned them. Sarah's producer stopped whispering instructions in her earpiece, captivated by the unexpected direction of the interview. The delegates from neighboring African nations nodded, knowingly recognizing their own stories in his words. "Yet my students came to class hungry, walking barefoot on roads that led to mines owned by others." The contrast between the UN's marble luxury and his descriptions created a palpable tension in the air. "My mother died believing her son would remember where he came from," Ibrahim concluded, his gaze returning to meet Sarah's directly. The hallway had grown completely silent, even the distant sounds of traffic seeming to pause. Her cameraman continued recording, sensing that something profound was unfolding before his lens. Sarah felt an unexpected tightness in her chest as she realized her carefully crafted questions suddenly seemed trivial. The young captain waited patiently for her response, his presence somehow filling the grand space with humility. Around them, diplomats and journalists stood witness to a moment that would reshape how many of them understood leadership. Sarah felt her journalistic composure wavering as Ibrahim's words hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. "Your mother," she began, her voice softer than usual. "What was her name?" The question surprised even her producer, who had been expecting aggressive follow-ups about policy and economics. Ibrahim's eyebrows raised slightly, puzzled by the personal direction of her inquiry. "The Crowd of delegates sensed a shift in the atmosphere, their attention sharpening like predators detecting vulnerability. Her cameraman zoomed in, capturing the subtle transformation in her expression. As professional distance began to crumble, Aminata Traoré, Ibrahim, replied, his voice carrying the reverence reserved for sacred memories. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and her press badge suddenly felt heavy against her chest. The name echoed through chambers of her mind she had, sealed decades ago, unlocking doors she convinced herself were better left closed. Her grandmother's stories flooded back, tales of a brave woman in West Africa who had defied colonial authorities to educate village children. She was born in 1952 in a small village near Babila Lasso. Ibrahim continued, unaware of the earthquake his words were creating. The marble floor beneath Sarah's feet seemed to shift as her carefully constructed identity began to fracture. My grandmother, Sarah whispered, her professional mask slipping completely. She used to tell me stories about a teacher named Aminata. The confession escaped her lips before she could stop it, drawing gasps from nearby journalists who knew nothing of her family history. Ibrahim's eyes widened as he processed the impossible connection unfolding before him in the sterile UN corridor. Her producer frantically gestured for the cameras to keep rolling, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. The autumn light streaming through the windows seemed to illuminate a truth that had been hidden for 30 years. Around them, African delegates leaned closer, recognizing the cosmic justice of this moment. Sarah Mitchell, Ibrahim said slowly as if tasting each syllable, your real name. What is your real name? The question pierced through layers of reinvention and professional ambition, like a spear finding its target. Her hands trembled as she realized that the young man she had mocked on international television might hold keys to her own forgotten identity. The diplomatic crowd held its collective breath, witnessing a revelation that would reshape everything. Sarah Khanate, she whispered, speaking her birth name aloud for the first time in 20 years. The sound of it in the sacred space felt like prayer, like homecoming, like the end of very long exile. Ibrahim's smile was gentle, knowing, as if his mother's spirit had orchestrated this moment from beyond the grave. Ibrahim's smile carried the warmth of recognition as he gestured toward a quieter alcove, away from the pressing crowd. My grandmother Fatoumata knew your grandmother well, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah followed, her legs feeling unsteady as decades of buried memories began to surface like artifacts from an archaeological dig. The marble gave way to a small seating area overlooking the lake, where the afternoon sun painted everything in golden hues. Her cameraman hesitated, uncertain whether to follow this intimate moment that was transforming from interview to reunion. The distant sound of Geneva traffic seemed to fade as two souls connected across continents and generations. Ibrahim settled into a chair with the same quiet grace she had observed in the hallway. Grandmother Fatoumata used to say that the baobab tree remembers every drought, every flood, every child who played in its shade. His words painted pictures of a world Sarah had only glimpsed in childhood stories and faded photographs. She found herself leaning forward, hungry for details that might fill the empty spaces in her family history. The Swiss autumn air carried no trace of the red dust and acacia trees he described, yet she could almost smell them. She taught me that leadership is like tending a garden. You must know every plant, understand its needs, and never forget that you are servant to the soil. Her professional skepticism dissolved completely as his grandmother's wisdom washed over her like cool water on parched earth. When I was 12, she took me to the sacred grove where the village elders made decisions. Ibrahim continued, his eyes distant with memory. Sarah's notepad lay forgotten in her lap as she absorbed every word, each one a thread connecting her to a heritage she had abandoned. The lake beyond the windows reflected clouds that reminded her of the vast skies her grandmother had described in bedtime stories. She made me sit in silence for 3 hours, listening to the wind in the leaves, the calls of birds, the whispers of ancestors. His voice carried the reverence of someone who understood that some lessons could only be learned in stillness. The busy world of international politics suddenly seemed shallow compared to the depth of this ancient wisdom. That day she told me the story of two women who taught children under the mango tree. Your grandmother Sarah and my mother Aminata. The revelation hit like lightning, illuminating connections that had been hidden in darkness for decades. Sarah felt tears she hadn't shed since childhood, threatening to spill as the puzzle pieces of her identity finally began to fit together. The sophisticated woman who had built a career on European elegance was discovering roots that ran deeper than she had ever imagined. They dreamed their children would meet someday, though they could never have. Imagine it would be here in this place of marble and glass. Ibrahim's words carried prophecy fulfilled, destiny acknowledged, and the gentle irony of fate's perfect timing. The UN building suddenly felt less like a monument to power and more like a temple where long separated souls had finally found each other. Ibrahim's expression grew more serious as he watched Sarah process the weight of their shared history. Your grandmother Sarah left because she believed her children needed opportunities that couldn't be found in our village, he said quietly. The afternoon light filtering through the windows seemed to dim as heavier truths emerged from the shadows of their conversation. Sarah felt the familiar guilt that had haunted her family for decades, the unspoken shame of abandonment disguised as ambition. But the price of that progress was steep. You lost your language, your stories, your connection to the soil that nurtured your ancestors. His words weren't accusatory, but they cut deep nonetheless, exposing wounds that had never properly healed. Around them, the opulent UN building suddenly felt like a gilded cage. Beautiful, but hollow. I understand why she made that choice, Ibrahim continued, his voice carrying compassion rather than judgment. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized how her career had been built on perpetuating the very narratives that had driven her family into exile. The colonial system was designed to make us believe that everything valuable existed somewhere else, in someone else's hands. The irony was crushing. She had become one of the most eloquent voices reinforcing those same destructive myths. Her decades of dismissing African potential on international television now felt like betraying her own blood. The Swiss lake beyond the windows reflected a sky that seemed to mirror the storm brewing in her consciousness. When you laughed at my vision on your broadcast, you were using the master's tools to tear down the master's house, Ibrahim said with gentle firmness. His metaphor struck her like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the cognitive dissonance that had ruled her professional life. Sarah realized she had been unconsciously punishing Africa for failing to keep her family, while simultaneously celebrating the West for offering them refuge. The comfortable certainties of her worldview crumbled like ancient walls facing a determined siege. Your grandmother died hoping her sacrifice would help her bloodline thrive, not knowing her granddaughter would one day mock the very dreams she died protecting. The weight of generational pain settled on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy cloak. But perhaps, Ibrahim added, his tone softening with hope, this moment is why our grandmother's spirits brought us together. Sarah looked up through tears. She could no longer hold back, seeing him clearly for the first time without the filters of prejudice and professional distance. The young man before her represented everything her family had abandoned in pursuit of acceptance in a world that would never fully embrace them. Maybe their sacrifice was never meant to be the end of the story, but the beginning of a return journey. His words carried the possibility of redemption, of healing, wounds that had festered across continents and generations. The marble floors beneath their feet suddenly felt less cold, as if warmed by the recognition of long-delayed homecoming. Sarah's voice barely rose above a whisper as she began to speak, her professional composure completely abandoned. My mother never told me the whole truth about why we left, she said, her fingers nervously twisting the press that suddenly felt like a costume. Peace. Ibrahim leaned closer, sensing that decades of buried pain were finally seeking the light. The Swiss afternoon seemed to hold its breath as Sarah prepared to excavate memories she had spent years trying to forget. She said, "We were coming to America for better opportunities." But there was something else in her eyes. Fear, maybe even shame. Her voice cracked as she realized how much of her own identity had been built on incomplete foundations. After the independence movements, our family faced threats because grandmother Sarah had taught colonial administrators children alongside village children, she continued, each word feeling like removing stones from a dam. Ibrahim nodded knowingly, understanding the complex dynamics that had torn so many families apart during those turbulent years. The lake beyond the windows reflected the late afternoon sun, creating patterns of light that reminded Sarah of the scattered fragments of her family's story. Some villagers saw her as a collaborator, others as a revolutionary. She couldn't win either way. Her mother had carried this burden in silence for 40 years, protecting her daughter from the complexity of their heritage. The weight of this revelation pressed down on Sarah's chest like a heavy stone. She sold everything, her mother's gold jewelry, the small plot of land that fed our family for generations, even her wedding dress. Sarah whispered, the material sacrifices seemed insignificant compared to the cultural wealth that had been abandoned in the Exodus. Ibrahim's eyes reflected deep understanding of the impossible choices African mothers had been forced to make. Also, I could have a Western education, a Western name, a Western future that would never question where I came from. The irony tasted bitter in her mouth. Her success had been purchased with a deliberate eraser of everything that made her who she truly was. Her mother's love had been expressed through a kind of cultural suicide, trading authenticity for opportunity. And now, Sarah said, looking directly at Ibrahim, I realize I spent my career validating the very system that forced my family into exile. The confession hung between them like incense in a cathedral, sacred and heavy with implication. Her mother's sacrifice had been meant to protect her daughter from the pain of being African in a world that devalued African dreams. Instead, it had created a weapon that her daughter had unknowingly turned against her own people. She gave up everything so I could belong somewhere. And I used that belonging to mock the homeland she never stopped missing. The generational trauma crystallized in that moment, revealing patterns of pain and displacement that stretched back decades. Ibrahim reached across the space between them, his hand briefly touching hers in a gesture of understanding that transcended words. Sarah stared at her reflection in the darkened window of the UN building, seeing for the first time not the polished international correspondent, but a frightened child who had learned to hide her true self. The woman looking back wore expensive makeup and designer clothes, but her eyes held the same uncertainty that had haunted her. Grandmother's final photograph. I don't even know who I am anymore, she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of a lifetime of pretending. Ibrahim sat quietly beside her, understanding that some revelations required silence to fully emerge from their hiding places. The Swiss evening had painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, colors that reminded her of the African sunsets her mother had described in rare, unguarded moments. Her carefully constructed identity was dissolving like sugar in rain, leaving her raw and exposed, but somehow more real than she had felt in decades. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Every dismissive comment about African leadership, every subtle eye roll at African ambitions had been a form of self-hatred disguised as professional objectivity. She had spent years unconsciously punishing an entire continent for the displacement and identity crisis her family had endured. I became everything they wanted me to be, she said, her voice hollow with recognition. A perfect example of successful assimilation. Ibrahim's presence beside her felt like an anchor in the storm of her unraveling worldview. The marble floors beneath her feet suddenly seemed cold and lifeless compared to the red earth her grandmother had once walked. Her success had been built on the grave of her authenticity. Each career milestone, another step away from her. True heritage. When I laughed at your vision on television, I was really laughing at the part of myself I'd been taught to be ashamed of. Sarah continued, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. The confession felt both liberating and terrifying, like jumping from a cliff without knowing if there was water below. Ibrahim's quiet strength gave her courage to excavate truths she had buried so deep she'd forgotten they existed. Her mother's warnings about not seeming too African suddenly revealed themselves as survival tactics born from trauma, not wisdom. The professional mask she wore had become a prison, separating her from the very stories that might have given her work meaning and authenticity. She realized she had spent her career as a ventriloquist for voices that didn't value her humanity. Looking at Ibrahim, Sarah saw reflected back to her all the possibilities her family had abandoned in their flight to safety and acceptance. His quiet confidence, his connection to purpose larger than personal advancement, his rootedness in something deeper than career success. These were the qualities she had mocked because she feared she could never possess them. You represent everything I was taught to believe was impossible, she said, her voice thick with emotion. The young captain before her embodied the dreams her grandmother had died protecting, the vision her mother had sacrificed to pursue elsewhere, and everything I was too afraid to believe in. The mirror of their encounter showed her not just who she had become, but who she might still choose to be. The reflection in the window had changed. She could see traces of her grandmother's strength beginning to emerge through the cracks in her professional facade. The Global News Network studio buzzed with unusual tension as Sarah prepared for what would become the most important broadcast of her career. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the notes she had written during the sleepless night following her encounter with Ibrahim. The teleprompter remained blank. For the first time in 15 years, she would speak from her heart rather than scripted words. Her producer paced nervously behind the cameras, certain about the direction Sarah had insisted on taking without corporate approval. The makeup artist had worked overtime to conceal the evidence of tears and soul-arching that had marked her features. The red light blinked on, signaling live transmission to millions of viewers who expected their familiar, confident anchor. Good evening. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and tonight I owe you an entire continent a profound apology. She began, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening beneath her composed exterior. The control room fell silent as producers realized this was not the scheduled international news segment. Her usual smirk was replaced by an expression of raw honesty that seemed to reach through television screens into living rooms across America and Europe. 3 days ago, I mocked a young African leader on this very program, dismissing his vision with the casual cruelty that has become my trademark. The words hung in the air like incense in a cathedral heavy with confession and consequence. Her cameraman zoomed in, capturing the moment a journalist chose truth over career security. But I learned something that night that changed everything I thought I knew about myself and my role in telling the world stories. Sarah's voice gained strength as she continued, drawing power from her vulnerability rather than her usual professional armor. The studio light seemed brighter, more honest, as if even the equipment was responding to the authenticity of the moment. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't just challenge my assumptions about African leadership. He helped me discover that I am African, too. The revelation rippled through the studio like a stone thrown into still water, creating waves that would reach far beyond the broadcast. Her producer's hand hovered over the emergency cut button, paralyzed by the magnitude of what was unfolding live on air. My real name is Sarah Connate, and my grandmother was one of the teachers who helped build the foundation for the Africa that leaders like Captain Traoré are working to restore. The confession felt like shedding a skin she had outgrown decades ago, revealing someone more vulnerable, but infinitely more real. Phones began buzzing in the Control room as executives realized their star correspondent was dismantling everything they had built her image upon. I have spent my career perpetuating narratives that diminish African potential because I was taught that my own African heritage was something to overcome, not celebrate. The words carried the weight of generational pain, finally seeking light and healing around the studio. Crew members found themselves witnessing not just a news broadcast, but a public resurrection of long-buried identity. The anchor who had built her reputation on dismissing African dreams was using that same platform to validate them, completing a circle her grandmothers could never have imagined. The response to Sarah's broadcast was immediate and seismic, rippling across social media platforms like wildfire in dry grass. Within hours, Ikusa Konite was trending globally as viewers shared their own stories of cultural displacement and rediscovered identity. Her corporate bosses faced a deluge of calls, some demanding her firing, others praising the network for finally allowing authentic voices to emerge. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim watched the replay on his phone, a gentle smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he recognized the profound courage her confession had required. University students across Africa organized viewing parties, dissecting every word of what they called the awakening broadcast. The seeds of transformation had been planted in the most unlikely soil, a sterile television studio that had become a garden of truth. Messages poured into the network from African diaspora communities across the world, thanking Sarah for giving a voice to their own struggles with identity and belonging. A sociology professor in Lagos wrote about the broadcast in her next lecture, using it to illustrate the complex psychology of post-colonial identity. Ethiopian journalists in Washington, D.C. reached out, inviting Sarah to join a collective focused on authentic African storytelling. Her colleague, a second-generation Kingals reporter, knocked on her office door for the first time in 3 years, tears in his eyes as he shared his own family story. The ripple effects expanded beyond media, reaching into classrooms where teachers use a broadcast to discuss the lasting impact of cultural displacement. Each conversation became another seed, germinating in the fertile ground of shared experience and recognition. 3 months later, Sarah found herself standing in the red dust of Bonduki village, the place where her grandmother and Ibrahim's mother had once taught under the same mango tree. The children who gathered around her spoke French MO and broken English, their eyes bright with curiosity about the woman who had come from so far away to hear their stories. She was no longer Sarah Mitchell, international correspondent. She had become Sarah Conate, cultural bridge builder and truth teller. The baobab trees her colleagues had once dismissed as mere scenery now stood as monuments to endurance and memory. Her new documentary series, Returning Home, had already changed how major networks approached African stories. The laughter that had once mocked African potential was now amplified by African voices, telling their own stories with dignity and power. In newsrooms across 3 continents, young journalists of African descent watched Sarah's transformation and began their own journeys toward authentic storytelling. The encounter that had started with mockery in a Geneva hallway had become a catalyst for a new generation of media professionals committed to dismantling harmful narratives. Ibrahim's vision, which had once seemed impossible to Sarah's professional cynicism, was being validated by a groundswell of voices refusing to be diminished. The seeds planted by 2 grandmothers under a mango tree had finally begun to bear fruit in ways they could never have imagined. Children in Bonduki now learn about Sarah Conate alongside Ibrahim Traoré, understanding that sometimes the longest journeys home begin with the courage to remember where you truly belong. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning. The unexpected encounter between a mocking news anchor and a young African leader revealed the profound power of authentic connection and rediscovered identity. Sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the courage to remember who we truly are. Subscribe and share your thoughts on this incredible journey of Homecoming Below.